On these, if you're happy with it as it is, just keep it with you in your Bible or whatever. We could also do the same thing and laminate it so it's better for you. But anyway, there you are, and I need to take one for the sake of the message. These are four different maps from three different books, Bible atlases that I have. I don't remember, Scott, if you ended up having to change anything on any of them or not. I don't think you did. That should be really helpful for today's message, particularly. Basically, maps 1 and 2, if you look, they all have a number. 3 and 4 is just got extra space, and those are some maps that may be helpful later on in Genesis, so I had them print those too. There's a level of detail in these maps that you usually don't find in your map in the back of your Bible, and so for that reason I wanted to include it. And we will begin then. You can turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14. And I don't get to do this very often, but the next, we'll probably have maybe 3, maybe 4, I don't think more than that, messages on Genesis 14. Not because we're going to spend all our time looking at these maps and talking about these places. I could care less, in one sense, about all that, other than just we want to know where we're actually talking about. But because I think there's actually a lot here that is helpful for us to really internalize and spend some time thinking about. These first 2 messages on this chapter will be kind of parts 1 and 2, and I don't ever get to do this, but I'm able to alliterate my title this time. So we're talking about Abram's 2 tempting tests. Okay, so maybe that'll help you remember it. Chapter 14 is about 2 tempting tests, not one. It's not one story. They're 2 distinct tests that are a real source, you might say, of temptation for Abram, because they're in precisely these areas where we've already seen him fail miserably in his life, post God's call. And so it's really relevant in that sense. So I would like to pray, then we would read, we'll read Genesis 14 and begin. Heavenly Father, we come before you again and want to sit under your word and ask you to take this text, which for many of us in some ways with Melchizedek and what goes on here, a bit of a head scratcher, and in other ways just seems kind of irrelevant, a strange story for us to read about, and make this thing real to us and of lasting significance in our lives, that we would come to see Genesis 14 as a potent text in your word and not one that's just to be passed over or of no significant use to us personally. And we confess there's a lot of passages in the Bible that if we're honest, we feel that way about, and we don't want to feel that way about any of them. And so we're seeking your help and your influence in all that we're doing here today, the rest of our time. I ask you to own the time and allow these words in this chapter to do the work you intend. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, try not to get too bogged down as I read, looking for all these places on your map. We will go through that briefly as we work our way through the text later. So just try to listen and imagine, if you would. So in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, these kings made war with Berah, king of Sodom, Bershah, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is, the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they had rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Imim in Shaveth Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim, with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled into the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their provisions, and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share. All right, as I said, a bit of a curious story. It's not the kind of story we imagine ourselves reading in the New Testament, right? It seems a little far removed from our concerns of the gospel, and yet that's certainly not true at all, and I hope to show that. I titled these 2 messages, at least, Abram's 2 tempting tests, and I want to just talk about that, what these 2 tests are as I see it. The 2 tests had in common this feature. They were to seek, the temptation was to seek the blessings offered by God in ways that set aside God's program or God's command or God's reputation. So God has kind of said, remember from Genesis 12, God had promised all these great things for Abram, and they're kind of all offered to him, but in ways that don't require him to submit to God or follow God's program. They're all offered to him here in this chapter. What will he do? And he refuses that. He passes the test. The first test, in a sense, was he was commanded, right, to be a blessing to others. The nature of that blessing was that he was to bless others out of the blessing which God has been to him. He was to take what had been given him from God, whatever status he had, whatever abilities he had, whatever knowledge of God that he had, and to bless others with that. He was to see himself, in a sense, also because of what he was just promised in Genesis 13, where God told him, you're going to have the land, I give it to you. He was to see himself as the divinely appointed man to whom all of this land of Canaan belonged. It's all his. So if he's trusting God, he's seeing, all this is my land, and he's remembering that God has blessed me with these things so that I can be a blessing to others. And when so much of the land was just now then subdued by these foreign armies, made subject to them, even his nephew was taken captive and carried away by them, how would Abram respond? There are actually quite a few options, and I want to we'll talk about those as we go. And so this first temptation has to do with what sort of interest he would take in securing the good of those around him. How determined was he to bless them and to look out for them, even especially, you might say, his own relative, almost particularly singularly his own relative. It's particularly Lot that he looks after. So that's one thing. How would he respond to the terrible things that happened to these cities and to Lot? That's one test. And we'll see reasons why that's maybe a greater test than you might initially think. Then secondly, second temptation. As God's man chosen to begin bringing God's blessing to the world, Abram is supposed to act in such a way that serves God's interests best, right? He does all this. God calls him out into this land. He's to go, he's to serve God. God says, I'm going to give you these things so that you can take this blessing to others. And as you do that, I'll provide for you. And this blessing will be successful because I have a blessing that I want to give to all the nations. You're the chosen instrument, Abram. And so he's supposed to act in such a way that serves God's interests best and not merely look for the quick or easy path to what some might call a better situation for himself. We saw him fail at that in Egypt, right, when he sold his wife. And he failed miserably. But he got ahead, but he sold his wife, and it was an awful thing. And so this is the kind of guy that he has been. The temptation is, the reality is God's promise of blessing is not meant to turn Abram into a self-seeking person. There's a lesson for us in that, right? God's promise of blessing for you, God pours things out for you in your life. That's not meant to say, oh, look at all the stuff I get. Let me just pull it all up and enjoy all these things. It was actually meant for another thing entirely, to turn Abram from a selfish, self-seeking person into a generous person, a selfless person. One who's so enamored with God that he seeks every opportunity to honor God in the world. He's concerned for God's interest. Now, the king of Sodom came looking, and I'll explain all this next week, to kind of barter a deal with Abram and to reduce God's greatness in the eyes of others and to reduce Abram's greatness in the eyes of others. Some of that will become evident after today, and then especially then again after next week. The king of Sodom comes in kind of to lessen Abram's reputation and the God of Abram's reputation, and to exalt himself and kind of get himself in a better situation. So this is what is happening there. Now, so two temptations. First, the event that happened, how will Abraham respond? And then secondly, once he was successful, how does he respond to this temptation offered him or presented to him from the king of Sodom? Now, for today, we're just going to consider this first temptation that comes when this invading army essentially wipes out many that lived in the land. They captured Abram's nephew, and they left the land under tribute until further notice. The temptation was to take a passive response. That was the temptation, to take a passive response, to let it blow over, and pick up the pieces as one who maybe benefited from their downfall, right? I mean, he's supposed to get all this land. What's the problem? All these other people live there. Here comes a foreign army and wipes them out. It's like, man, look, Lot chose that land. God told me I was going to get it. This must be what he meant, right? Go over. Now I'm going to move away from Hebron and the oaks at Mamre, and I'm just going to go live over in this valley. Why not? Why go rescue them? I mean, the people that are later destroyed in Sodom and Gomorrah are the very ones that Abram rescued from these people. I mean, he traveled over 100 miles to go get them back and deliver them back into the land. And then God wiped them out. I mean, why not just let them go? God didn't mean for them to be, eternally possessors of the land. God killed them in Abram's lifetime, just a few short years later. But this is how so this was the temptation. More than that, again, remember, Abram had been a self-seeking, opportunistic person. He could have begun maybe scheming how to perhaps align himself either with these foreign armies who were coming through and kind of gain security for himself in the land that way, or maybe to form some sort of a plan after the armies came through to get together with all the kings and the people that were left and say, hey, we've got an opportunity, let's together go take the land and let's figure out how we're going to resist them next time, and we'll defeat them next year when they come back, or whatever. What's the plan? Come up with some alliance of these kings and have a larger, more substantial army ready when they come. There are all these different ways he could have approached this. And instead, he went off and gathered up a few hundred men and took off at night and captured these guys, sent this army to flight. Now, the first thing I want to do in terms of explaining, that just kind of tells us what the temptations are a little bit. In terms of explaining the chapter, is to explain all of the players in the chapter, who these people are. And some of them, admittedly, we really don't know much about at all. And that's okay. But so if you would, briefly turn to the map number, what's labeled number 2. Most of you probably, like I have always read this, have always thought that this was kind of, because you never bother to go look and see where all these people are from, the thinking is that this was kind of 5 kings from Canaan fighting against 4 kings from Canaan. And that wasn't the case at all. These are like world power guys, right? That come in and invade and subject these Canaanite cities. So in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, everybody see Shinar there, kind of south of Babylon a little bit, along the Euphrates River? See it in big bold letters, Shinar? You just could nod your head. I just want to make sure everyone sees it. Okay. That's the point of the map, right? So if you're not seeing it, I need to do something different. Okay, so there's Shinar. Now, so there's, isn't this, you see down at the bottom of Shinar, right next to the R, it says there's a little city there. 2 letters for that city. What's the name of that city? Ur. Who just left there? Abram. Right? It's been a while, but he left there. That's where he's from. These guys have come all across the Fertile Crescent, all the way over now to Canaan, and they're making war, subjecting the land where the rulers from the place that he left are now in charge in the place that he's come. It's quite a thing. Okay, we keep going. Arioch, king of Elasar. We don't know where that is. We don't know. We don't know where that is at all. Let me say a couple things real quickly about these names before we get too far. Despite much effort, we have not yet been able to positively identify any of these kings through archaeology. Like none of the kings mentioned in any of these cities or anything, we haven't been able to identify 100% any of them. We can tell, however, that their names are correct, meaning like they fit the time period. Like if I were to ask you, give me a name of a Babylonian era, someone from Shinar who might have been king in that time. What's his name? Like, you would just, I don't know, you'd say King what? Make up a name. Good luck with that. And then when the archaeologists look at all the artifacts and say, oh, people had that kind of name back then. Good luck guessing that, right? So we do know from archaeology that these names fit the time period and fit the regions generally from where they're from. The problems we have with some of the places is it's like, well, there was this people group that kind of had that name and they were over there, and then 100 miles further over here there was people that several times in history were kind of given a name that really is similar to that. It's hard to know which group it is. It's not that there's nobody who could qualify, it's just that there are difficulties. There are possibilities, there are options, but there's difficulties coming down conclusively with one group or another. So, again, so far when I say that archaeologists have not positively identified a certain king as any other known king that we have, don't let that sound like a weak case to you. What that means is, so far, no one over there has dug around in the dirt and found a tablet or a pot that said, this guy, and it's a name from the Bible, is this guy, and it's another name from a king that we know. Like that's what that means. We haven't yet found a tablet that tells us specifically this guy is that guy, conclusively. Amazingly, we have tablets that do tell us that about other people occasionally. That's a remarkable thing. But we don't have anything like that. The other thing, again, that we do know is that this sort of thing is exactly what was happening during this period of history. Some of you may remember just from world history classes growing up that in this Fertile Crescent area, I mean, you always had Egypt fighting for the land of Israel and Canaan and all that, and then you had, Babylon and people out there who were also fighting for that because the major trade routes went through the land of Canaan, also into parts of the Mediterranean. That was kind of the hub of where so much of the trade went, and so people fought for control over it. And in a time of history when might made right, if you had enough power, then you decided, and nobody could stop you. Often, mighty kings would go out and impose their might on others. That was the whole point, to go and enforce their will on other places. And you might think of this, you'd force them to serve this king with tribute and with allegiance. You could ask it this way: what else was the point of a standing army that was highly mobile than to travel to other places and take things that didn't belong to you by force from people who weren't willing to give it to you? That was the point. And so that's why you'd have this kind of an army. Now, all right then, on to the persons again mentioned in chapter 14. We mentioned already Amraphel, king of Shinar. We saw where Shinar was. Arioch, king of Elasar. We're not sure where that is. That's why you might look on the map and we have arrows from possible places, and we're just not exactly sure, but it's maybe over here, maybe over there. We're not 100%. Then what do we have? Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. And you see Elam specifically mentioned on this map here, map number 2, which is that's where it was. The land immediately east of Babylon. The name likely, the name of this guy, Chedorlaomer, this is interesting, likely means son of the unsparing. Son of the unsparing. Now we get that. I mean, there's reasons for saying that. Probably, if you think if someone has that title, some king has son of the unsparing, that's his title. He's probably a self-made title, probably, or one given to him as a reputation he had for exactly the kinds of things we read about here. I mean, it's not surprising that his name, the guy who leads this coalition of foreign armies into Canaan and just wipes everybody out, is called son of the unsparing one. I mean, of course he is. It seems to be that way. Another thing to know about these things when it says son of such and such, some of you might be familiar in the New Testament, things like son of destruction or child of wrath. It means as this kind of characterizes you or characterizes your future. So when someone say you're a child of God, well, you're like God. To be the son of the unsparing one, maybe there was a god they worshipped who was kind of had that name, but probably it just means like he's unsparing. And he's so unsparing, it's like he's whatever the qualities of being unsparing are, he's that personified. He's the son of unsparing. That's what we mean, right? This is the idea. And so this is this man. And then we have Tidal, king of Goim. Again, here with him, the names appear to be authentic to the archaeologists. Not much can be said definitively. There's a question mark on this map too. Goim, or is that where they are? There are, from periods of like 400 or 500 years later, peoples that live there that are given that name. That's also, Goim is a word, a Hebrew word, or an Israelite word, for a Jewish word, for nations. But there are sometimes you have Goim nations. It's like a particular kind of, or a grouping of nations. But anyway, so this is what we're talking about. So we're talking about people who range all the way over from past Babylon through the whole Fertile Crescent, a coalition army in a sense. They've all agreed to conspire together to go make these cities in Canaan pay tribute. Now these Canaanite kings, we have, if we start in verse 2, these kings made war with Berah, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. There are 5 kings mentioned, only 4 names are given. The 5th one, the king of Bela, that is Zoar. Zoar is a place name. When they're saying Bela, nobody knows that evidently, as Moses is writing this, where the heck Bela is. He says, well, that's Zoar. That's where that is. It's now called Zoar. So this is and all these other kings are given their names and their place. These kings' names, I don't want to get into it because it's like probably 5 minutes apiece to explain all of it. But everything I've read shows that these kings' names, several of them, particularly, their names are all associated with like evil root words. We talk about, earlier in Genesis when people are named, a lot of times they're given a name that sounds like this other word. And then when they name that person, they say, because I've finally gotten one. Sounds like gotten because we've gotten one. It's not the word, their name isn't gotten, but it's so close, and that's why they gave him that name, because it's kind of a word play. And the idea is, and we know this true also in many of the Talmudic writings and stuff that the Jews did about their own scriptures, they would harp on this, these evil names that these guys had. And of course, we're told elsewhere in Scripture these were evil sinners against the Lord. We know God destroyed them for their wickedness. We know all of that, this whole group of cities. We remember in Genesis chapter 13, when Lot chose the Jordan Valley, it says, and Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. Parentheses, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's a very prosperous land, but it's full of evil people. And it appears that perhaps the kings of that place had names that were also associated with their evil practices. Very possible. We have in Targums that the Israelites would deliberately mispronounce their names to emphasize their evil nature. And that's interesting. Like if you had a name that was, like for instance, let me just give it this way. It wasn't long ago we had a president named Barack Obama. And you never heard, people often called him Barack Obama, right? Some people called him Barry, right? Because that was his given name, right? And when they did that, when people that did that, you knew they had a pejorative view, a low view of the president. Or some would honestly pronounce his name or say his name, Barack Hussein Obama. And you never heard people do that unless they were trying to imply something about it, right? They kind of, in a sense, they just said his name. What's the problem? Well, but you're mentioning his middle name because it has associations with Middle East and with people that we don't necessarily want to associate with, and you're trying to be pejorative to him. And it's this way too, like you could pronounce these men's name in a way that kind of poked at them a little bit and talked about how evil they were. And this is often what the Israelites would do in their other writings. Intentionally mispronounce their names to emphasize their evil nature. Again, notice all the men are not mentioned, only 4 of the 5 kings. I can't imagine why that would be. I don't know, but it is. He's not mentioned. The king of Bela or Zoar. The Canaanite cities that are mentioned, we know were later destroyed, except for this little town of Zoar was not later destroyed. The question is whether, we might ask, where were they at this point? When they existed, where were they? And if you turn to your other map, on map number 1, in the Dead Sea, you'll see this kind of part of land that sticks out, little peninsula there, and you'll see Sodom, question mark. South of that, you'll see Gomorrah, question mark. Then you'll see Bela or Zoar, no question mark there. Then Admah, question mark. And then you have Zeboim, question mark. We're not 100% sure. These places were destroyed, and archaeologists aren't all 100% sure. But that's the guess as to where these places are. There's reasons for that. We know they were at the southern end of the Dead Sea. We know they were in we think they're most likely at the southern end of the Dead Sea. We know they were in the Jordan Valley. We know they were around this Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. We know that they were close to this valley of Siddim, which is south of the Dead Sea. We know they were later destroyed by God, and other than Zoar, there's not much trace of these towns anymore at all. So we have lots of reasonable theories. We have lots of places maybe they've unearthed a little bit, and they can't prove conclusively, yes, this was Sodom or this was Gomorrah. It's just a guess. The dates don't maybe quite match. The town appears to be too old or too young, and it's not 100% clear. So anyway, that's where these places are. So let's then just begin, now that we've kind of familiarized ourselves a little bit with the players and the layout of the map a little bit. Let's just consider the text again as we go through and kind of keeping our eyes on this map as well. First of all, just to think that it wasn't a couple of city chiefs that Abram routed and that was traveling through here. These were large armies of huge global forces at the time. An international coalition of world powers, think of this, comes down hard on the land of Canaan. That's really amazing. It's possible that we have three kind of battle scenes here in the sense that I'm not 100% decided on this one, but the first four verses, you would have these four kings out here from Mesopotamia. They come in, and there was a war that they had with these five kings in Canaan. And the result of the war is that, verse 4, for 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer. In other words, they were subjected. In an original war, they were subjected. We're not told how the kings from Mesopotamia got over here, which path they took originally, but we're told that they had come over and made war. This is the first instance of war, that word war, in the entire Bible. War. Here it is. They made war, and they subjected them. For 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year, they'd had enough, and they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated, and it goes on and starts talking some there, and we'll pick it up there in a minute. But what's going on here? Well, for 12 years, what are they doing? They're probably sending through emissaries or representatives of these other kings. They're sending the harvest and the produce of the land, right? Or they're just giving it to them, and then they just sell it, or whatever happens. But they pay tribute. They serve him. Now, there are four kings that they're serving, but here it says, only mentions one. 12 years they'd served Chedorlaomer, which means he's the one who's in charge of this thing. He's the leader, in a sense. The 13th year they rebelled. Why didn't he attack them in the 13th year? Well, he sends his people out there. It takes, months to get out there, all the way out there to Canaan from Mesopotamia, from the far reaches of Mesopotamia. They get out there, go to gather everything up, and either the people refuse and say, go back home, or more likely they kill his people that he sent, and nobody ever comes back. Months go by, more months go by, and then he realizes, okay, now I know what's happened. And so he goes out the next year, he prepares for war, and he goes, and he makes war. So that's likely kind of the first, there's the first bit. So now he comes to the second round of things. Now in the 14th year, what happens? Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated. And here we begin. If you look at your map on the top right, you'll see the attack route of the four kings. They come down, and they come first. There's in all caps, Rephaim, and it says Ashtaroth Karnaim. I know we've got question marks here, but really it's not that. It's just a matter of, is it that town or is it one 5 miles over? It's that kind of question, right? So it's not like we're just making stuff up. So they defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim. There's a whole people group, right? It just defeats them. The Zuzim in Ham. So he comes down a little further, makes his way over there, defeats them. The Emim and Shaveth Kiriathaim. All right, come on down a little ways. You'll find right next to the Dead Sea, the Emim. Those are the people that lived in the land of Moab before the Moabites. We know that. And then he goes on. And the Horites in their hill country. Go on down way south of the Dead Sea, about an inch down or so on your map, you'll see the name Horites. There they are. In their hill country of Seir. Then he goes down as far as El Paran. Keep going all the way down. You see right there on the edge of the sea down there, El Paran. On the border of the wilderness. Then they turn back. They head up north to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh. They come all up there to Kadesh. And what happens there? And defeated all the country of the Amalekites. So there's another people group. I mean, these guys are wiping everybody out. And also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. They come on there, make their way down up to the Dead Sea, and they defeat other people that are in their way. Now, the question, of all the people they've defeated so far, which of these people were in rebellion to them? None of them. They weren't, these cities, these places were not the ones who said we're not paying tribute. It's like a show of force. Or perhaps it's maybe more, maybe last time they came in down through Hebron and those places, on this time their return route, maybe they came down that way and came in and defeated those kings. And this time they think, while we go, we might as well get some more territory and let's go down on the eastern side, in the eastern mountain ranges, and let's go attack all those settlements and let's make them tribute to us as well. I don't know. But none of these places had been in rebellion. Notice also, if you look over by the Dead Sea, on their journey south, they passed by Sodom, Gomorrah, Belar, Admah, Zeboim. They passed by those places. It would have been a difficult route to get down there, but it's like, in a sense, you pass by and it's like there's these warnings, like here we come. They went way out of the way down to El Paran, came back up, probably to refresh the army and spend some time recovering. Then they come back up to Kadesh Barnea, make their way over to where the Amorites are, and then on into this valley of Siddim. This army is fast-moving. You might think, because it's so fast-moving and it's just taking one place after another, that they are maybe a small army, kind of just a band of marauders just going through and destroying stuff. Anyway, we have these 5 kings. They come together and take a stand against them and attempt to hold them off. But these 5 kings gather all the people they can muster, meet them in this valley of Siddim, and they are quickly defeated. They're so quickly defeated. Listen to the way it describes it. Look at this. Let's look at the end of verse 9. 4 kings against 5. Here we are. Verse 10. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, didn't it just say these 5 kings gathered together to go out and meet them and to make war? And it says, now the valley where they went out to make war had these bitumen pits, and as they ran for their lives, some of these people got caught. Where's the description of the battle? I mean, how quickly was this over? It's a joke. You guys are getting killed. You don't have a chance against this invading army. So it's not just a small group of people who's kind of taking these towns by surprise. It's a big army, because when these 5 kings gather together and say, we're going to make a stand, they're not even told that they fight, or just that they flee. They just run. I'm sure there was some fighting, but it wasn't going well. The way it's described, they just fled. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, which is like, basically you have oil there that is like just kind of seeps up in places. This is what we mean by bitumen pits. So you imagine a pond, but it's not a pond. Like a small pond, but it's not pond. It's oil. It's tar. It's like, well, you don't want to fall into that. And this valley is full of these places all over. Right? It's like the real-life version of the Dead Marshes. Right? This is what we're talking about. Here we are. And this is where they choose to have this fight and to make their stand. Undoubtedly, they were going to, with their cities behind them, they were going to go in advance and meet in a spot where they thought they could hold them off. Maybe, I'm sure they had hoped that these men would be the ones falling into the pits. But it was them. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the rest are fleeing up to the hills. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. So Lot didn't go out to war with these guys. He stayed back in Sodom. It wasn't his fight. He was just he just lived there. He wasn't a Sodomite. He wasn't in that sense, he wasn't someone who was a native there. Wasn't of their people. But nonetheless, so even though on the map, when it shows this battle taking place in the Siddim Valley, and then it doesn't show then from there it just shows they just took off and started leaving the land, we know because of the text that they actually went and traveled into all of these cities, taking everything that was there. And we might be tempted to say, oh, they just took the possessions, just the stuff, and their provisions, the food from the harvest and things like that, and just leave it at that. But when you go back and if you look at verse 16, when Abram brings everyone back, he says, then he brought back all the possessions and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and the women and the people. So they went in and they took the people, they took the women. Why are the women distinguished from the people? Probably because if you were a woman and the town you lived in was overrun, your fate was a little different than the kids or the old men, things like that. Like it's almost unspeakable, right? The kinds of things that happen to you. It's something different. So he brought back all the possessions, everything, the animals, the grain, everything that was there, brought back Lot and all his stuff, brought back all the women from these towns, brought back all the people that had been taken. He brought back them all. So when it says down here that they took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and then went their way, it's not just the stuff. It's the people, all the kinds of things you would not want to imagine happening in the place where you live if some army came in. Those are the kinds of things that happened in Sodom and Gomorrah and Bela and Admah and Zeboim. Now, they take everything. They took Lot, right? And all his possessions. Now, we've gone through this part of the text just in terms of trying to understand what was going on and where people were and all that kind of stuff. Let's look at the map here just a few more minutes. From the battle at the Siddim Valley, you'll see we have the likely route. Let me pause and explain one thing to you. You have these little crisscross dotted lines kind of all over the whole map. Those are, this is what you added. If you look at the key up at the top, known trade routes. Those are known roads. Like archaeologists amazingly know, like that's a road that existed at that time. It traveled this way. So they get up here to the Siddim Valley and they take a road on up to Hebron. Isn't that where Abram lives at the time? He's in Mamre, right there. That's where he lives. They pass through there. They continue on up all this way, all the way up to where you get to the top of the map, they get to Dan. That's the likely route. So this is where Abram hears about it. As they're passing through, he's not done anything. He's not decided to make war and meet these men like these other guys did. The other kings said, we're going to meet them here before they get to our town. Abram, he's like, let them pass through. As they're passing through, someone escapes. Verse 13, then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men. So Abram's content in a sense just to let him go. Doesn't concern him, like whatever happens here, that's okay. But when he hears that his kinsman Lot has been taken, now he says, okay, and he just turns and immediately gathers his men, says, prepare, and they go out, and what happens? When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. This number, 318, that's a lot of people. Trained men, trained soldiers. Not a standing army that he just kept paroling his borders or something, not like that, but men who knew how to wield a sword or a club or a hoe or a sickle or whatever it was they may have had, but they knew how to fight. It says these were trained men, right? Born in his house, 318 of them. It's a bit of a question for me as to whether he had 318 of these men who had been born in his house, or rather, there were 318 men total who went. Of that number we already know, because it says later in the text, let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share, that these other men who were residents of the area, Mamre and his brother Eshcol and Aner, his brothers, so three brothers, Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner, had gone with Abram, likely taking their men as well. It might be that the total force was 318 men. What Abram contributed from that was all the men who had been born in his house who were of age and could swing and could run and could make the trip and have enough strength to make the fight when they got there. It may very well be that way. It's not 100% clear how to understand this. I tend to read it that way. Probably a total force of 318 men. And he went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, if you look down at the bottom right hand of your map, you see this key about distance, right? That's less than an inch equals 30 miles. Now find Hebron again, and let's just kind of guess. I mean, what are we talking, 30, 60, 90, 100, 110 miles to Dan? They take off, right? Were they behind them by a day, 2 days? I don't know, but I mean, how many miles can you run on foot in a day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, armed and ready to fight? And where are you getting your provisions? Where are you eating? What's going on? They've got to hustle to get up there, in a sense, and then they take them, it says, he gets there, and he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants. Why do that? Why do it at night? Because it's a big old army, and you got 318 men, that's why. What is it, 1,000, 2,000? How many men do they have? A lot more than you have. So he attacks them at night and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, which no one knows where that is, north of Damascus, some town north of Damascus. So they went from Dan. Now think of this. They attacked them at Dan. Now think again of the scale. Look at your map again. Pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. That's like, at least, just to get to Damascus, it's like 50 miles. What does this look like? I mean, they're just constantly, these guys are running for their lives, trying to get away, and every time they go to set up somewhere, here come, I mean, is it a continual chase, or is it they defeated them, and then the guys take off, and they're like, okay, since we're divided, you guys go this way, and you guys go further, and when they come there, you'll be ready for them. And how does it look? You know, they playing leapfrog as Abram's two or three forces he's divided up. You know, one guy, you guys go 10 miles up, you guys go 40 miles up, you guys go 60 miles up, and just wait, because they're going to come right through this valley on that road. When they come, ambush them. I don't know what it looks like, but the result is this army of however big it was, that the four kings who came in are left with nothing. Abram brings back all of it. He brought back all the possessions, and also brought back the kinsman, Lot, with his possessions, and the women, and the people. Like, none is lost. He gets them all. It's incredible. Which makes me think in Hebrews, we have in Hebrews 11 these things that Abraham had done by faith. And then there's later we read about verse 32. What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. It's like, yeah, it's not just like there's one or two guys who fit this example. Like Abram did a lot of this stuff by faith. Conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises. He didn't stop the mouths of lions that we know. He didn't quench the power of fire that we know. He did escape the edge of the sword. He was made strong out of weakness. He did become mighty in war. He did put foreign armies to flight. The result of this, Abram comes back from war as king of kings. You've got a war of 5 kings and 4 kings. The 4 kings whooped up on the 5 kings so fast you couldn't even describe the battle. And then Abram took off with a few of his buddies, and he beat those guys. Abram's king of the kings. Like, he's incredible. And it's like, Abram lives there in this land, and he's just like he's kind of an outsider. They even call him a Hebrew. Verse 13. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew. Hebrew, that's something we call the Jews. They don't call themselves Hebrews. They don't call themselves that. It's possible it's kind of an ethnic name for a larger group of people, but it's also likely it's kind of a social name that refers to people who are kind of on the outside edges of society. For instance, they go down to Egypt and they're the Hebrews. Why? They live in this other land and they do things, they tend animals that we don't like. They're unclean to us. And they're Hebrews. They're marginalized people out on the edges of cities, countries. There may be foreign slaves. They're mercenaries. They're people who don't fit with, you don't want living in your town that you try to make safe and secure for your family. These Hebrews are out there. Now, Abram's a righteous man, but he's called a Hebrew. And probably for good reason. What does he do? I mean, he's called a Hebrew in this context where this outsider makes war. He goes out on a mission for his nephew Lot, and in a sense for the king of Sodom or for the people of that area, and rescues them. It's incredible. This sheep herder from Ur, the Chaldeans, spent some time in Haran, who's going out here living out on the slopes and the outside places in Canaan, defeats this coalition army from the great forces in Mesopotamia and sends them running for their lives, literally, because they don't take anything else. They just escape with themselves. What a thing. Now, let's backtrack here and just consider a few more things. I want to quickly review some things we saw in Genesis 13, which I think will bring some matters to light in Genesis 14. First of all, consider Abram's character. Remember that in Genesis 13, his character was much improved from what it had been from Genesis 12. Where there, out of fear, he had sold his wife to save his skin and to make a profit. In Genesis 13, we find him giving Lot his choice of the land, willing to take whatever the leftovers may be. Lot, you define for you what you want and the places that you want to be, and I'll stay out of it, and you just tell me where the borders are. And Lot says, all that area down there by the Jordan River, that's all mine. You can have what's left. He says it's watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. And so he takes it all the way down in the direction of Zoar. He takes like the entire Jordan Valley, all the way down to like, in this map, down to like where the end of the Dead Sea. He takes the whole thing for himself. And Abram is willing to take the leftovers and trust God's provision in that situation, whatever it may be. Now that's totally different than what we found before. That's his character. He's willing just to trust God with what comes. We talked about him being so content, right? We talked about that last week a bunch, about he was so content to take God at his word and not have to scramble and fight for himself and come up with the better things and argue with Lot. And when there were these divisions, he didn't say, okay, well, every other month you'll be in this area and then we'll switch back and forth and come up with the fair treatment. He just said, look, God's going to provide for me. Take what you want. That was his character. He was a changed man. We also saw in chapter 13 Lot's separation from him. We see Lot willingly remove himself from Abram and from Abram's influence in his life and from all the promises that God had made Abram to bless Abram and through Abram to be a blessing to others. Lot walked away from that. Think of this. Lot sought his blessing not in connection with Abram, where God said it would be, but in the lush pastures of the Jordan Valley. He had a choice, right? Be with Lot, Lot, you can be with Abram, where God said God's going to bless Abram, and those who bless Abram, God will bless you too. He could have done that. But instead, he said, I'm going over here to the Jordan Valley where things are better, as he saw it. And that had to be hard for Abram to witness, to see Lot take off and separate. And he never did come back. I mean, even after this scene, and we'll talk about this in a moment too, he still didn't return to Abram. I mean, Abram saved his life, and where does he go? Back to Sodom. It's crazy. And then we also saw God's promise to Abram. So three things that we saw in chapter 13 mainly. Abram's character was changed, Lot separated from him, and God makes a promise to Abram, a better promise than he had already, or maybe a further promise, not a better one. Verse 14, the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So you're going to have more descendants than the dust of the earth, and everywhere you can look right now, from where you are, north, south, east, and west, I give it all to you and to your offspring forever. That's a promise. The land will belong to Abram and his descendants after him. God gave it to him. But oddly, in that chapter, and in 14, we still find Abram dwelling in a pitched tent, not buying fields, not taking up the land and claiming these things in that sense. In fact, we find him referred to again, as I said, as a Hebrew, as an outsider, someone on the outside of society, living on the fringes of the towns. This is where we find him. So I want to just ask then, okay, if that's from 12 that we find here in chapter 13, he had made some changes. How does Abram succeed here where before he had failed? Or how has he grown? What's the point of the story? What's changed in Abram? I think that's the whole reason these stories are told. So I just want to consider that just briefly. What's different in Abram? What do we learn about him here? This first temptation. Well, he succeeded in it. That's the first thing. Unlike in Genesis 12, where there was threat of physical harm, things might not go well for him. It's a big risk to go down to Egypt. He sells his wife, says, wife, just look, they're going to kill me anyway. Why don't you just, they're going to take you one way or another. So why don't we just lie and say you're my sister? And then when they take you, it'll go well for me rather than I die. And so that's their plan, and that's what they do. And they tell all these lies, and they get in all kinds of trouble, and of course, the Egyptians are cursed for it. Pharaoh and his house is cursed for it. And Abram goes back to the promised land with his tail tucked between his legs, having dishonored God, having shamed his own self, dishonored his wife, not provided for her. It's a mess. Well, here, one of the things we talked about then was in trying to get at what Abram was thinking and whether he really thought his wife might actually be given in marriage. A point we made there was that, look, at that time, when Sarah was taken, he didn't go fight for her and try to protect her. He just let her go. Whereas here, in Genesis 14, when Lot's taken, he goes and fights. And I think that's a marked improvement, I would say. I mean, before, even for his own wife, he wouldn't defend her. Now, for a nephew, for a selfish little snotty-nosed nephew who took the best for himself and doesn't want anything to do with him anymore, when that nephew is taken, he goes to war. He risks it all to go get him. What a thing. And he stirs up these men who are with him and says, let's go. And they come too. These three brothers who he's gotten so well acquainted with, who let him live kind of in their area. What a thing. That I would mark that as success. In terms of the amount of care you take for those who are nearest you, this is a vast improvement from where we were 2 chapters ago. Abram's growing. Abram's learning. He's a different man. He's succeeded. He's passed the test in that sense. How else has he grown? Well, I'll say this. He's trusting God enough to take the risk even of physical harm and physical death in order to be the blessing he ought to be. We saw in Genesis 12, Abram's not willing to risk anything for righteousness' sake. We saw in Genesis 13, for righteousness' sake, he's willing to risk prosperity. Things could be better for him, but he'll let Lot have it. It's okay, he's going to trust God. God's going to be his provider. It's all right. I want to go with God, even if it means I don't get the best thing right now. God will make it up to me. So he's learned something. He's willing to risk prosperity. Now he's willing to risk life and limb in order to help other people. This is a different man. I mean, he's totally changed. He's grown so much. Not the same kind of guy. I'm going to read a couple verses from Obadiah, which, believe it or not, I've preached through twice. Just not in this church. So Obadiah chapter 1, the only chapter there is, in verse 10, I'll just begin reading. And listen to this scathing rebuke that God gives to the Edomites through Obadiah. Now, Israel had been overrun and taken captive. The Edomites, which are descendants of Esau, when this happened, they went into the land, and rather than help the Israelites, they just went in and took all their stuff. Took all the stuff they could and just got rich. And this is how God rebukes them. Because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, you just stood by and watched it happen. On the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were just like one of them. But do not gloat over the day of your brother in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of his distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth in the day of his calamity. Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head. And he just goes on. What a thing. What a rebuke. That could have been Abram, right? He could have said, man, look at all this. They took all the stuff. I wonder what's left. Let's go back into town and gather what we can. Take those fields for ourselves. He could have done those kinds of things. But he didn't. Instead, his response wasn't, oh man, poor Lot. Too bad for Lot. Instead, he got up and he got all these men and they took off, risked everything. A couple points here to make. First of all, this is the main one really. One of the main points of the text, I think, is to show God's promise fulfilled. God made a promise to Abram. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you or those who treat you illy, in an ill way, I will, down to the man, I'll curse them. Right? Like, I'm going to protect you. I'll be with you. So that you will be this blessing and that the blessing will expand to others. I'm going to do that. And what else did he promise him? Well, let's do that. Let's do this one first. So he promised him that. We see that fulfilled. Abram, here he is, walking in love, no longer just a self-serving person seeking his own self-preservation. Instead, he hazards these things in love to go rescue his nephew, and God blesses them. They have great success. I mean, this army that laid waste the whole countryside, no problem for Abram and these 318 men. It's really remarkable. It's really remarkable. And he comes back and gives to these other. He doesn't claim all the possessions on the people for himself as slaves, which he had by the way, he had the right to do. Some of you might remember earlier in Genesis we talked about covenants and the way God, there would be like a suzerain, which is called kind of a ruling king. And they were the ones who had either conquered you or through your need of their assistance had earned the right to be your king. And they dictated terms. And you could live and you could have your things and you could have your land and all that stuff and your family, but the terms were whatever the king said they were. If he said, look, just like what happened here earlier in verses 1 through 4, they fought, and Chedorlaomer and the ones who were with him said, okay, you're going to serve us in these ways. And for 12 years they did, because that was the deal. Abram could have done that. He could have said, okay, now that I've conquered all of your enemies and delivered you all, and you owe me your very lives, this is what you're going to do for me now. Every year, about springtime, I'm going to come by, and you're going to have these things. Or he could have done anything. It all belonged to him, which is what makes what the king of Sodom does like so ridiculous. That he's like, how about I'll give you these things if you give me these. It's like, what are you talking about? Bow. Man, recognize you're better. It's amazing. And this is, anyway, that's next week. But so, God provides for him in an amazing way, rescues him. And another thing that God had promised in Genesis chapter 12, and this is the other point I want to bring out here. Verse 2, Genesis 12:2. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you are a blessing. God says, I'm going to make Abram's name great. And I would submit to you that this is the main place where Abram's name was made great. What do I mean? Turn with me to Genesis chapter 23. Verse 1. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah was roughly 65 when they came to the land. So she lives for 62 years, pretty much, in the promised land. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. That's where we find Abram basically living now. So he spent most of his time, his base of operations, even though he was traveling about with his herds, was kind of there in Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abram went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abram rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, those are the ones who lived in the land, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Not until Sarah dies does Abram buy any property. He's there for 60 years and never bought a thing. Right? So here he buys something. The Hittites answered Abram, Hear us, my Lord. You are a prince of God, or a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. So we're not going to explain all this text, but just say, notice their response. You're like a prince of God among us. You are a mighty man among us. All of us would be honored if you would bury your dead in our tombs. Take your pick. Nobody will refuse you, I assure you. That's what high esteem we hold you in. Well, okay, where does Abram get this reputation? Well, one place he would get it would just be his day-to-day life, right? He's an honest man, a sincere man. God's with him in the things that he does. But how does he become this mighty man among them? Well, we have this event. I think we'll all agree, nothing up until now in Abram's story would make him a mighty prince among people. Let's just look briefly I'll just look at the headings in my Bible up to that point. Genesis 15, God's covenant with Abram. Nothing there that really includes any of them. 16, Sarai and Hagar. Yeah, that's a real winner. That's a man who's a mighty prince. Not even close. Abraham and the covenant of circumcision. Nothing there. That really applies. Then we have Genesis 17, 18, 19. Abram intercedes for Sodom. Those cities are destroyed. Who hears about that but Abram? And maybe Lot. Like, nobody knows anything about Abram's intercession there. Doesn't mean anything. And then you have Genesis 20. What does Abram do? He goes over to the Philistines and he lives in Gerar and he tries the same junk he tried in Egypt on Abimelech. What a mighty man. Like, he's lucky he's not killed. God intervenes again and saves his life when the whole thing was found out. And all this was because of his fear. Then Isaac is born. Then he sins, then Isaac is born. And then we have later that same Abimelech that he lied to before now comes, and there's a dispute about the well, and Abram does the right thing, and we see his righteousness having grown then. Then in chapter 22, the sacrifice of Isaac. I don't know many people who, other than Christians, who think that, and Jews who think that was a good thing. You almost killed your child. What a mighty man. Right after that, we said, okay, Sarah dies, and here's what happens. They say, you're a mighty prince among us. This is the place where Abram's name was made great. This battle. It's the kind of thing that all the region was telling. Did you hear? We were just going to let it happen. Here's Mamre. You can imagine Mamre and his brothers. They come for dinner, and they're thinking, I cannot believe he convinced us and talked us into going with him. What in the world? We got up there, and I can't believe we were successful. Did you see the look on those guys' faces when we ambushed them further on up? Did you see what happened when we did this? And we got everything. And of course, Abram made sure that they got their share of the spoils. Verse 24 of Genesis 14, I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share. Abram's name was made great. God fulfilled his word. Abram had to go along with this, though, in a sense. If Abram went around and kept lying and cheating everybody, his name would never have been great. But his character has changed in such a way that now God can exalt him among the people as a source of blessing, as an honest man, as someone who they can look to and learn about God from, receive a blessing. So there's that. Now, just some quick things in terms of application. There's a phrase that occurs earlier in Genesis that I think is really relevant for this. Has to do with Cain and Abel. After Cain had killed Abel, Genesis chapter 3, verse 9, the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Anybody finish it for me? Am I my brother's keeper? Contrast that to Abram here. Like Lot had dismissed him, had left, never to return. And he gets in trouble. And it's like, I'll just say this, put yourself in Abram's shoes. Is there a friend who's distanced themselves from you and they don't want anything to do with you anymore? Is there a relative who they just have gone astray from the family? They don't really have anything to do with them. And you get word things are bad for them. Like, what's your response? Abram says, let's go. Right now, let's help them. Save them. If we can, let's do what we can for them. What a difference. What a contrast. He sees himself as his brother's keeper. Because he's his brother. Like, why wouldn't you be that way? We often ask questions, things like, are they deserving? Like, have they gotten themselves into this mess? Well, Lot had. He chose to go down there, knowing these people are evil. I mean, evidently, because the text says, now, when he went down there, these are evil sinners against the Lord. And he goes. And he's living there in Sodom with these people. Here comes the army, and they know it's coming. And he still doesn't leave Sodom. He stays. I mean, what are you doing? This guy, his whole life, never wanted to leave Sodom. It's unbelievable. This is what happens. And he gets captured, and he's taken off. He gets taken away. But it's as though Abram was asking another question, not is he deserving, but what does love demand? Right? What does love demand? And it demands that he does all he can for him, for his kinsman. He was content not to bother himself with the political affairs and the international politics of the day when these kings were rebelling against these and now they were suffering for it. Like, that doesn't really concern him. Not that those things weren't tragic, but that just, okay, like that's nations will war against nations. But it's like, we could debate whether, well, maybe he should have cared. Okay, maybe he's not arrived at a place of perfection yet. I'm willing to go with that. But when someone came who he had this love for, who he cared about, someone from his past who traveled with him, a nephew of his, as undeserving as he was, as much as he's brought it upon himself, what does love demand? Love demands I go. I risk everything. There aren't a lot of times, right, in your life where love requires you to risk literally everything, but there are times. A lot of times that comes to us by way of just uncertainty, right? You know, well, if I do this, I don't really know, I don't have any idea what's going to happen. You know, is this going to be a domino effect here, or what they call like the butterfly effect, you know, it's going to create this whole big different scenario for my whole life now because I just risked this thing, and we can get paralyzed in that fear. And that's not where Abram lived. He's doing these things by faith. What has he got? He's got all these fears about if I go there, we could die. But he's got this promise from God. I'm going to bless you. This is going to happen. You're going to have descendants. The land is yours. And he's just trusting that, and loving Lot causes him to go and make war. Things that would be written about, told to generations and generations of people. So, that's just the last question I want to ask. It's just, I think we ought to ask in these kinds of situations. Is to ask, look for promise, say, will God be with me? Has God made me a promise in this situation? Is there something about, okay, so there's somebody who's got this particular need? Search the Scriptures. How has God commanded me how I ought to address it? What does love demand in this situation? Okay, well, that's risky. Well, has God made me promises about meeting those risks, to comfort me so that I can move out and act on this thing? Or should I just remain paralyzed? Or is God asking me to move out and act in love with no promises? Well, that never happens. There are always promises from God for these things. Will God be with me? What does God promise me as I seek to bless others in these ways? So, again, we see a totally different Abram in this chapter, a transformed man. It's not he's going to fall again. It happens. We see him doing the same thing like he did in Egypt. He's not perfect by any means. We cannot believe how does this kind of guy treat Hagar the way he does? I don't know. That's inexplainable. But so is the sin in my life and the sin in your life. It's not explainable. It's not excusable. It's there. We want to make war against it. We want to conquer these things. We're not content to let our last chapter to be like our first chapter. But this is what's going on. So we see, again, it's in summary, we see God's promises to Abram being carried out, being fulfilled. He makes a great name of Abram. He protects him. He gives him deliverance. He curses those who treated him in this way. He even treated those who were associated with him. He didn't do anything to Abram, But they took Lot. Abram says, no, no, no. You're not taking my nephew. As much of a weasel as he might be, you're not going to take him. And this is the way it is. And Abram, we see him walking in love and in concern for others. He's not self-interested the same way he was. He's walking in faith, confident God is with him. Well, okay. Are there questions or comments on any of this that we've looked at?